Now, it is, we've been working for the whole day. It's been fascinating already. We've got people from all around the world, from Hong Kong, from the US, from Canada, from Australia, from all across Europe, from Israel, from many countries. And I'm delighted to, I was going to say to close today, to close this part of the presentations with Ben Mijuskovic, who is, I've studied loneliness and solitude for a number of years, but always ahead of me, and having published in this field, I think the leading figure in this field on the philosophy and the understanding of loneliness as an existential issue, not as a medical disease or a psychiatric disorder, but as loneliness and the philosophical psychology of humanity. Ben is affiliated to California State University in the USA, but as he was saying just a minute ago, he is, I think you could say, a man of the world in the literal sense that you have roots all over the world. So it is my pleasure to introduce you, Ben. Ben, you will talk for maybe 30 minutes. I will give you a 5-minute warning before the end, and then we will be able to have time for questions and discussion.
Okay.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Julian. Let me also confirm that I'm not into psychiatric medications. My work on loneliness has to do with the mind, independently of psychiatric interventions. I worked for 25 years with mentally ill people, and I found that the medications were often counterproductive. But anyway, let me launch into the paper. Current researchers studying loneliness claim that it is passively caused by external conditions, including familial, environmental, cultural, situational, and even chemical imbalances in the brain, and therefore that it is transient, avoidable, and temporary. The controlling principle, paradigm, and metaphor of the current neurosciences is that the brain is like a computer programmed by external causes and conditions. By contrast, I argue that loneliness is actively constituted, not caused, by A, the innate structures of Kant's reflexive self-consciousness. This is the critique of pure reason. And B, Brentano's and Husserl's transcendent intentionality, as their texts are Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint and Ideas, a general introduction to pure phenomenology, and therefore loneliness is continuous, unavoidable, and permanent. Plato defines the soul as a self-conscious substance in the Theaetetus and the Sophist. Aristotle does so in the Metaphysics, 1075a. Augustine uses the cogito and contra academicos, and Descartes in the Medications. Leibniz connects self-consciousness and spontaneity in the Monadology, and Kant in the Critique. And Brentano connects teleological intentionality with Aristotle's final causes in the Physics and in the Metaphysics. Brentano, as you know, was a Catholic priest and a dualist, and he supports Plato and Aristotle's arguments for the immortality of the soul. The psyche, soul, self, mind, or ego displays two active modes of consciousness. First, there is self-consciousness, reflexivity, circularity, unity. Quote, I am aware of my own thoughts and they are mine and not someone else's, close quote. This is Augustine and Descartes' cogito, Kant's unity of consciousness. Second, there is Brentano's and Husserl's principle of intentionality. Quote, I intend, I target objects or meanings, goals and values beyond myself, close quote.
I'm so sorry, may I interrupt you briefly? Your
Sure.
Camera is showing the top of your head. And if you were able to pull it down just a little, we would be able to see. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Not at all. Augustine and Descartes' cogito. Second, there is Brentano's and Husserl's principle of intentionality. Quote, I target, objects or meanings, goals and values beyond myself, close quote. Intentionality is intrinsically teleological, purposeful, directional. This is both Brentano and Husserl. Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Descartes, and Kant are all dualists, and so am I. The problem with dualism is if the soul or mind is immaterial and unextended and active, and matter is physical and inactive and extended, then the two substances share no common attribute, properties, or accidents in common. If so, then it is impossible for the mind to know the external world or to physically interact. There are three responses to the problem of dualism. One answer is Locke in the essay states, quote, God could have created thinking matter. The second answer is from Augustine. I believe so that I may understand, Augustine and Anselm. And I have found, and Kant states, I have found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. By the way, Descartes belonged to the Augustinian oratory. The third answer is Hume's. Hume claims that matter and motion, nature and effect, can cause perceptual consciousnesses, perceptions that are non-physical. In other words, that matter and motion can cause mental perceptions. In my book, Contingent Immaterialism, I support Hume's thesis. Since early Greek philosophy, there's been a perennial battle between scientific materialism and human consciousness, between matter versus minds. Plato, in his dialogue, The Sophist, describes it as an endless battle between the giants and the gods, the materialist and the idealist. Today, it pits the sciences of materialism. All that exists is matter plus motion, mechanism, human beings are machines, determinism, everything that happens is physically and psychologically the result of causes and their effects. For example, psychoanalysis, empiricism, all knowledge is based on sensations and experience, phenomenalism, both the self and reality are merely sensory appearances, constructions of sense data, behaviorism, human conduct can be reduced to stimulus response behaviors, and the current neurosciences, everything we feel and do is caused by brain neurons and electrical synapses. In opposition, I support consciousness, which promotes either dualism, there are two substances, both active immaterial minds and extended matter, or idealism, all knowledge ultimately depends on the mind alone, rationalism, some truths are known independently of experience, epistemic spontaneity, which is different from free will, which is moral freedom. Phenomenology, consciousness is intentional, purposive. It intends meanings and values. This is going to be important later. And existential, each human being is alone and lonely, and each creates values for themselves alone and is ethically responsible for their choices. In short, science versus consciousness. This is Plato's battle between the two substances. In what follows, I wish to address four themes. First, that all human beings are innately lonely, that it is the universal existential condition of all mankind. Quoting the famous Polish novelist Joseph Conrad, we're lonely from the cradle to the grave. Second, why this is so, which involves two interrelated synthetic a priori theories of consciousness, namely Kant's reflexive self-consciousness and Husserl and Brentano's transcendent intentionality. The third theme is, what are the consequences of loneliness in relation to narcissism and the emotions of anger, anxiety, depression, suicide, and murder? And fourth, the remedies. The opposite of loneliness is intimacy as sought through the path of empathy. As soon as the biological needs for air, water, food, and sleep are met, the dual psychological drive, A, to avoid loneliness, and B, the desire to secure intimacy, are the two most powerful motivations in all we feel, think, think, say, and do. The essence of loneliness is separation. It is grounded in six distinct forms of separation. The first developmental stage of separation results from the fetus's expulsion from the womb, namely biological object-object separation. Reading Freud, quote, "Here is the situation which underlies the first great anxiety state of birth and the infantile anxiety of longing, the anxiety due to separation from the protecting mother." This is Freud and Ego and the Id. It represents the initial violence of suddenly going from security to anxiety in the fetus. The second developmental stage, at first there is only consciousness, no self, no objects, no external world, and no other selves. Hegel describes this first stage of infant consciousness in terms of sense certainty. The infant only senses and feels the sensory immediacy of the now quoted and this quoted, but there is no conception of time or space or objects. It is a pure, unreflecting, sensory feeling state of indeterminate consciousness. This is Hegel, phenomenology. Similarly, William James in the Principles of Psychology describes infant consciousness in the following terms. Quote, "The baby assailed by eyes, ears, nose, skin, and entrails at once feels it all as one great blooming, buzzing confusion," close quote. And Freud describes it as an oceanic feeling, as if the infant were submerged in the sea. At first, it is not aware of objects, only unattached sensations and feelings of hunger and discomfort, which it experiences as a totality, a boundlessness without limits and impediments. It, the baby to us, is absolutely self-contained, self-sufficient, complete in itself. It feels it is everything. It does not know. For it, the id, there is no knowledge, just feelings. This is the origin of primary narcissism, because at this stage, there is nothing else in consciousness. It is everything. This generates the second developmental stage of separation. At a certain point, the not yet ego realizes that it intentionally desires a specific, a unique transcendental object beyond and separate from its restricted sphere of consciousness. The mother's breast, excuse me, mother's breast as an inanimate object. This is the stage of self-object separation. It is intrapsychic, self versus external world. This is the first true stage of self-consciousness. Critique again. Third developmental stage. Soon the infant realizes that the breast belongs to another self-consciousness, an opposing consciousness, and then the narcissistic desire for unilateral recognition begins. It is a conflict for supremacy, for the domination of the self over the other's desires, and a struggle between the mother and the child surfaces. This is the stage of subject versus other subject separation, conflict, interpersonal relations, self-consciousness versus the other self-consciousness. In Hegel, this is described as the master-slave dialectic, quote, "It is a struggle to the death for recognition and dominance over the desires of the other self," close quote, phenomenology, lordship and bondage second. For Hegel, of course, the dialectic is always developmental. But for Freud, this is the dynamical source of narcissism and sadism, as the loneliness of the self becomes connected to interpersonal relations and conflicts of anger. This is Freud and civilization and discontents and beyond the pleasure principle. The analog to Freud's id is Schopenhauer's attribution of evil to an unknowable irrational will. Schopenhauer's term for narcissism is egoism, and he discusses St. Augustine's doctrine of original sin and problem of evil. In the Confessions, Augustine describes two infants suckling at their mother's breast, and when the first had had enough, he still tries to prevent his sibling from reaching her breast, and how he, as a boy, and some children stole into an orchard and maliciously destroyed all the fruit. During the First World War in England, mothers with children under the age of 1 were required to work in factories by helping in the war effort. The children were amply provided for physically, but were not nurtured or emotionally cared for. At first they cried and fussed, but later it was noticed that they regressed. They stopped their crying, became listless, withdrawn, and dramatically deteriorated physically, developmentally, and cognitively. Half the children under the age of 1 died. Because of the loneliness and the inattention, they retreated to the oblivion of the womb and chose death. The disorder went under several diagnoses, including hospitalism, marasmus, and anaclectic depression. Rene Spitz, in the 1950s, Spitz's monumental research brought to the forefront the enormity of the disorder. The fourth kind or form, not really a stage of separation, occurs sporadically when the ego, under intense and/or prolonged periods of social isolation, turns against its own self and spontaneously creates delusions, imaginary and hallucinatory selves within itself. This is, of course, psychosis. The fifth stage of separation is complicated but vitally important. This is the heart of the paper. It is self versus value separation. It is grounded in the philosophical distinctions between primary, secondary, and tertiary qualities. Primary qualities, actually quantities, are scientific. They exist externally to the mind. They refer to physical objects and events, to matter and its motions. These are the independent objects of scientific observation that can be intersubjectively studied and objectively measured. Motion and time also serve as primary qualities. Time is the measure of motion through space. Science is based on causal determinism and predictions, but human consciousness is free and spontaneous. By contrast, secondary qualities, sensations and feelings, are subjective and vary from person to person as they temporally continually flow or stream through an immanent and personal time consciousness. There are 2 times. First, scientific objective time, which is determined by the measurement of objects moving through space. And secondly, there is subjective, internal, and intimate time, which is lonely time. That's the time of James Joyce and Thomas Wolfe and the stream of consciousness. Tertiary qualities are existentially individual, and although they vary from person to person, they're cognitive. They are judgments that assert human intentions, human motivations toward values, ideals, between good and evil, beauty and ugliness, and intimacy and loneliness. Human beings are the only creatures in the animal kingdom who can spontaneously create and continually recreate and recommit to values and be guided for them as long as they live. Judgments of value principles are what distinguishes mankind from all the lower orders of animal existence. Values infinitely vary. For example, seeking wealth, love, street drugs, fame, safety, health, courage, intelligence, power, having children, not having children. Tertiary qualities, tertiary judgments of value are conceptual, and so their meanings are shareable. Sensations and feelings are not. I have my sensations, you have yours. But the salient point is that intimacy is a human value, a meaningful defense against loneliness. Both Hume, an empiricist, and Kant, a rationalist, distinguish between facts versus values, science versus morality, and the is versus the ought. For example, beauty is a value that can be studied in aesthetics, and goodness and evil can be studied in ethics. But there are other values as well, religious, humanistic, egoistic, and intimacy itself, and they're all values. As individuals, each of us continually freely chooses, makes judgments about our values. Shall I go to work or quit? Shall I get a divorce or not? Should I commit adultery or not? But science eliminates values. It reduces values to subjective secondary sensations, to the feelings of pleasure and pain, while relegating them all to scientific relativism. But for existentialism, the values are absolute to the individual. This is Sartre. Therefore, there is an enormous difference in how one reacts to situations of loneliness and intimacy, depending on whether they consider intimacy as a personal value for themselves or not. Max Weber, the famous sociologist, Protestant ethic and spirit of God, argues that scientists and politicians are constitutionally incapable of addressing issues of value. This is the vocation lectures. For example, a nuclear scientist can develop an atomic bomb, but he is morally incapable as a scientist of knowing when or how to use it. Accordingly, the fifth form of separation is when we're forced or we decide to separate from previously cherished values, motivational ideals through divorce, unemployment, loss of friends, and then how to replace those values. Gregory Zilborg, a psychoanalyst, is the first to discuss and analyze loneliness as a subject matter in its own right. This is Zilborg, 1938. And he draws on Kant's formula of synthetic a priori relations as the inseparable critical connecting link between narcissism, loneliness, and hostility. He argues that infants and children who are excessively spoiled, pampered, constantly accommodated, and indulged often feature features of entitlement issues, megalomania, maniacal symptoms, delusions of grandeur, grandiosity, are often accompanied by sociopathic disregard for the rights and feelings of others. According to Zilborg, loneliness and narcissistic anger often leads to retaliatory murders and suicides, for example, domestic violence. And of course, I worked for 2 years for Child Protective Services. The discipline of domestic violence is incredible. And of course, Zilborg is fully aware that already in 1933, Hitler and the Nazis were militarily threatening the nations of Europe. Hannah Arendt connects loneliness not only to Hitler's narcissism, but to the German nation as well, following their humiliation and punishment after the First World War. Indicted as well in her powerful chronicle are also Mussolini with fascism and Stalin with communism. This is a great work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1948. But it is important to realize that it is not only individuals who are susceptible to loneliness and resentment, but groups, nations, and races as well. The First World War, called the War to End All Wars, lasted for 4 years, 1914-18. The Second World War, also called the War to End All Wars, along with its Holocaust, civilian bombings, concentration camps, and its 2 final punctuating atomic bombs, lasted 6 years, 39-45. There is a Third World War that will be presided over by 6 narcissistic dictators controlling nuclear weapons, and it will be much, much shorter. Back to the individual. Lonely people often describe loneliness as a sense of emptiness and meaninglessness and valuelessness. However, in the narcissistic personality, this is a consuming trait. Narcissists endlessly seek extravagant praise. They demand trust from others, but are constitutionally incapable of tendering their trust to others. Freud described depression as internalized anger. Loneliness is chock full of anger. Individuals are angry with themselves and with the world. Lonely people are both acutely and chronically angry. Family, neighbors, and criminologists are mystified by seemingly random murders and suicides, by allegedly meaningless, senseless killings. The real problem is they're all too senseful of loneliness. Critical therapists are singularly oblivious to the knot of anger tied to loneliness. The anger has to be first addressed and acknowledged before turning to the loneliness. The anger is the primary symptom of the disease and should always be acknowledged first. The second writer on loneliness is another psychoanalyst, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, who is closely following Zilborg. She starts her article with an interview with a catatonic patient. After a number of failed overtures, she finally raises a single finger and asks, "That lonely?" and suddenly receives a flood of communications which cause her to conclude that loneliness is embedded in 2 essential interrelated meanings. A, the inability to communicate with others, the sense that no one is listening to you and therefore no one cares. And B, most importantly, she identifies loneliness with anxiety and panic. This is Psychiatry, 1959. And she desperately pleads for more research on loneliness. The third psychoanalyst is Erich Fromm. He adds guilt and shame to our list, but he also introduces and defines a new relation, intrinsically connecting loneliness to the presence of values, goals, and ideals, as he points out that the Trappist monk in his monastery and the political prisoner in his cell are not lonely. Their intimacy is secured by their transcendent values. But when we consider the meanings of hostility, incommunicability, anxiety, panic, guilt, and shame, and they're all constitutive species of the genus loneliness, we realize that there are other synonyms as well: rejection, betrayal, isolation, neglect, abandonment, jealousy, prejudice, revenge, low self-esteem, shunning, exile, ostracism. They are all active forms of feelings of separation and loneliness. There is also religious loneliness, Hegel's estrangement from God, Augustine's Confessions, and Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. There is also Hegel's alienation, Karl Marx's conception of man as separated from his labor, the product of his labor, his profits as he is forced into competition with his fellows, again, Hegel's master-slave relation. Thus, whereas Freud grounds his entire system on the single principle of the libidinal sexual energy and aggression, I would ask you to consider grounding all human motivations on the drive to escape loneliness and the desire to secure intimacy. The sixth stage of separation. According to Freud, death is the natural return of the organic to the inorganic. True, but it is also the realization that the world will carry on separately without you and not skip a beat. Following Freud's terminology, we can say that the essence of separation is death, presided over by the god of death, Thanatos, whereas the essence of intimacy is represented by the god of unity, Eros. Fourth theme, intimacy and empathy. The remedy for separation is intimacy through the path of empathy. Currently, we misuse the term empathy, and it usually means the same as sympathy or pity, but it would be odd for a mother to say, I empathize with my baby. The origin of the concept of empathy is actually formulated by Theodore Lipps, an aesthetician. Lipps created the concept to account for how the observer is able to penetrate the aesthetic expression of the artist. For example, the spectator projects his own feelings of grace, beauty, balance, joy, harmony, freedom, energy, so that they coalesce, they fuse and interpenetrate with the fluid expressions of the dancer. The feelings meld within the expressive movements of the dancer. Art communicates by expression, this is Koche's aesthetics. But the problem is that the aesthetic expression is one-sided. It is not reciprocal or mutual. The dancer is not aware of her admirer's expressions, feelings, emotions, and interpretations. But the essence of both empathy and intimacy is mutually shared expression. When Husserl tries to use the concept of empathy to overcome the problem of philosophical solipsism, he fails precisely because it is one-sided. Solipsism is the philosophical theory that only the narcissistic self is real. There is nothing else. Husserl tries to project the eidetic meanings of his own physical body into the spatial, the bodily place of the other self immediately, analogically, appresentationally, and thus one-sidedly. But it is not reciprocated or acknowledged by the other self. For Husserl, truth has to be intuitive, direct, and immediate, but his empathy is anything but that, and this is the Cartesian meditations. The problem is that it is impossible philosophically, theoretically, or conceptually to conceptualize the existence of the other thinking self. The best and only assurance we have is that others have feelings and minds like we do, is through empathy and intimacy. The solution to solipsism is affective rather than epistemic. The essence of true empathy and intimacy requires a mutual sharing of 6 conditions: empathic feelings, meanings, conceptual meanings, affections leading to intimacy, while intimacy itself commands a deeper and longer sharing of mutual trust, respect, and values. In addition, this leads to 3 relational forms of intimacy: equal intimacy, B, age appropriate, and C, status appropriate shared mutuality of trust, respect, and values. For example, as equal, imagine a young couple who has just experienced the death of their infant child. They share the values of grief and loss. Both know what it means to them, what it means in terms of their shared values, memories, and the loneliness, the lost hope of future companionship and nurturance. Or imagine, for example, an elderly married couple after a wonderful life together, learning that one of them has just been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and the lonely, empathic feelings of both the patient and the survivor for each other. And then consider the case of an age-appropriate empathic intimacy between a father and a son. The mutuality is quantitatively different, but qualitatively identical in terms of mutual trust and respect. Now, in the more complex case of status-appropriate empathy and intimacy, for example, in the relation between man and his transcendent God, the empathy has to be mediated through Christ's suffering on the cross, his anguished plea not to be forsaken, that connects, that empathizes with man's loneliness and fear of being abandoned by the Lord, as it forms the bonds of intimacy. Let me conclude. Freud is a genius, and his comprehensive psychoanalytic system is brilliant, but I believe it has three serious flaws. First, its psychological determinism. Two, sexual repressions and inhibitions are basically ignored these days. And three, there is no acknowledgement of the role of values in our lives in Freud. By contrast, existentialism stresses the freedom of consciousness, loneliness is universal, and tertiary judgments of value are real and personal. There are a bunch of references follow. Anyway, thank you for your time and attention. I appreciate the chance to give the talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. That is fascinating and such a rich account. And to be able to straddle the tensions, the anger, the narcissism, and the empathy, and to describe all of those human characteristics, I think it is very important and powerful that you can, for us, range across those qualities. We have time for some questions and comments. I see that we have, sorry, I'm getting my computer right now. I see that we have little hands that go up. David Weir has his hand up.
Can I just...
Oh, sorry, Ben, yes.
Let me just add one thing. For better or for worse, maybe because of what's going on with Trump in our country, I tended to focus a little too much on narcissism. But I worked with children for a long period of time that had been abused, and their loneliness isn't narcissistic, it's self-preservational, but the anger is there just equally as it is in the narcissist egoist. I just wanted to mention.
I like the way that you raised narcissism. I think a number of other countries, I'd be tempted to say my own, have leaders with more than their fair share of that quality. What would you say narcissism is? I'm sorry, I realise David is going to wanting to ask a question. What would you say narcissism is? Because self-love is clearly not a problem. Is it self-love of a bad person, or what is narcissism?
I mean, narcissism is equatable to self-preservation. I mean, we all have it. It's a matter of degree, and it's a matter of what the end of our narcissism is. Maybe it can be to do good, to help others. The best solution to loneliness, by the way, Julian, is to help another human being. It gets you out of your narcissistic self. But narcissism and self-preservation, if they're tempered and controlled, as Aristotle says, we learn to be good by doing good things. If it's controlled, we all of us need narcissism. But often it's competitive with others, and then it can be a problem. It becomes hostility.
Yeah, and it feels as though if narcissism is the only quality you have, it is a problem. David had his hand up. David, can I ask, are you still, David Weir, wanting to ask a question because your hand has gone down?
No, I took it down because I didn't want to be seen waving my hand about while you guys were talking. But I do have a question. Thank you, Ben, for a very, I would say, wide-ranging and integrated account. I'd just like to pick up on one point fairly early on. I suspect you were I would suggest unnecessarily dismissive of what we can learn from neuroscience, and I think there are some very interesting developments here which do cast some light and some doubt on some of the things that we've cherished in our philosophical grand parade. For example, cogito ergo sum. I think there's growing evidence from neuroscience that the cogito is unnecessary or maybe misplaced. Sum says it all. I am. Now let's look at what that entails and what opportunities that gives for those who claim some. In particular, I'm drawn to recent findings in relation from neuroscience in relation to neuronal firing sequences in the brain. Now it's possible to map where the articulation of what are essentially affective decisions differ from those where there's a stronger association with cognition and the abstract performances of mathematics and that kind of decision making. And it now seems fairly clear that the pattern tends to be that the affective predate the cognitive. Now, I think if this is right, if this is a sustainable series of findings, then we really have to think about how do we choose what we think about, and how do we create the values and the hierarchies. And there was quite a lot of hierarchical discourse in your presentation when we're talking about higher orders and lower orders of existence. I take the existentialist approach, but I think the existentialist now has to consider perhaps a wider range. I don't think this is stimulus response at all. And I suggest that my question is, are you being unfair to what we can learn from neuroscience?
In response to your question, I would direct you to my current book, which is called Consciousness and Loneliness, Theoria and Praxis. And there's an entire chapter. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Raymond Tallis. He is himself a very well-known, he's all over the place on Google if you just access him. The interesting thing about Tallis, I devote a whole chapter to him, and neuroscience, I'm criticizing neuroscience, is that oddly enough, ironically enough, Tallis is a critic of neuroscience himself, although he's a brilliant neuroscientist, but he uses idealist arguments in order to criticize his own colleagues. So I would refer you to the chapter. It's called Neuromania, or Tallis's book is called Aping Mankind. He's very well known. But he thinks that neuroscience has gone too far, that it has dehumanized human beings. So you might take a look at that. But, you know, ever since people like A.J. Ayer and Russell already are claiming that the cogito, there's a passage in Language, Truth, and Logic that directly challenges the cogito by using David Hume. Well, as it turns out, Hume himself muddles when he attacks personal identity and says it's a succession of impressions, which means that he admits that consciousness is temporal. It can't be temporal because the neuroscientists have problems with the flow of consciousness. the immanent flow of consciousness, which you will find in James Joyce's Ulysses, Thomas Wolfe's Of Time and the River, and those sorts of things. But I would refer you to that chapter, and I've offered my email address. And if you wish to look at that chapter, I'll be glad to get into a discussion with you about it. But do look at Talis's work independently of mine. You'll find it very interesting. But he's conflicted. He thinks neuroscience has gone too far. He's on Google all over the place. He wears a very stunning red hat and delights in parading it around.
Thank you. You paint a good picture. Can I mention, and I'm not sure if you mentioned it, I know you said in your paper in advance, we have put your paper onto the Teams system. So if people wish to go back and look at the references and so on, then they will be able to, just the participants in this event.
Yes.
And I'm very grateful to you for doing that. Alec Chavinsky, did you have your hand up?
Yes.
Oh, hello, Alec. I didn't realize we've corresponded.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Ben. First of all, I would like to say thank you that you said that Joseph Conrad was Polish writer. It's not a well-known fact. Of course, he was using English language, but he was born. Well, yes, he was born in a Polish family.
Do you know that Conrad is just one of the most incredible stylists? His way, it's just incredible. I'm very much. You could claim that the way I look at the world is through Heart and Darkness and Joseph Conrad.
Yes.
Let me also mention to you, if you don't mind, there's a book by Jerzy Kosinski called The Painted Bird. If you want to see anger. It's just incredible. I use it in a previous book and quote it readily.
But actually, I would like to ask not about a writer, not about book, but about movie. Imagine that I have lectures with students, and let's say topic of lecture is loneliness, and I would like to show them movie. Can you suggest any title?
I don't know. I just heard the movie. Oh gosh, it's by Ruth. Do you remember the movie? There's a gosh. I'll send you the email.
Thank you.
I will. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. I understand it's made as a movie by Carson McCullers. Yeah. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. And it's she was only 23 when she wrote it. It's just a marvelous novel. But I mentioned it in the book. If you look the big book that I just put out, if you look up Carson McCullers, McCullers, and it's called The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. It's my understanding they made a movie of it. Yeah.
I would suggest The Remains of the Day as well, but it's a long movie.
Oh, okay.
This one with Anthony Hopkins, yes?
Yeah. Okay. Can I say we don't really, but I would like to make time for one additional question from Piotr Domoraci, whom I know have corresponded with. So I would like to say hello myself. And to say you have time for a quick question and answer, and you have now seen each other.
We've known each other, what, 10, 12, 14 years?
Yeah. Nice to meet you. Hello, everyone. Hello, Julian. Thank you for the possibility of putting a question addressing Ben. Thank you, Ben, for your masterful lecture. It's unusual to be able to listen to your lecture. It's a great pity that COVID-19 did not allow us to meet in person. Let me ask you a question, maybe two, although I would like to ask a lot. How you can compare the ontological existential state of solitude to experience it psychologically? Which determines what? And don't you think that in scientific analysis of loneliness, we also let ourselves be seduced by the moods that, as Heidegger aptly observed, determine our understanding? I mean exactly what I mean here, and I ask your opinion on whether the existing divisions of loneliness in scientific literature are not so much descriptive of the phenomenon as variations on the experiences of researchers pretending to describe an objective phenomenon, or maybe there is no escape from it. What's your opinion? What could you state, Ben, in these matters? I'm curious of your statement.
During the time, many years I was a graduate student, Heidegger was very, very popular, and you know, I've read Being and Time and that sort of thing. He focuses a lot on language as well and that sort of thing. What bothers me about Heidegger, and between Hegel and Kant, I choose Kant because of the self-consciousness, the substance of the ego, instead of Hegel. I like Hegel, and he's an idealist, and that's fine. But Heidegger bothered me for two reasons. Being was in the world, and my being is not in the world. It has an antagonistic relationship to the world, I'm afraid. So I've stayed away from Heidegger. The other thing that bothers me is the emphasis on language. For me, language, following Bergson, is artificial. All human language is artificial for me. Feelings are genuine inside the person and that sort of thing. But the artificiality of language, empathy, for example, you could be empathic with someone without using language, that sort of thing. So basically, I prefer Kant over Hegel, and I prefer Kant over Heidegger. That's where, although Heidegger talks a lot about Kant and things like that. So the second issue, as I say, is language for me is artificial. And Bergson, Time and Free Will would be the best example of that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you a lot.
But send me, you know, the question. You've got my email, because it's a complex question. I'm not sure I got all of the elements of it, because congratulations on your book. I've got it, and I've got it in a very prominent place because we've known each other. One of the things I've been trying to do is reach out to Europe. I'm basically European. So I have a lot of problems with analytic philosophy. I have a lot of problems with science, so-called neuroscience, a terrible problem with it. So, but I'm trying to get home. I want to get away from. I want to. Anyway,
we're doing our best to get you here, Ben, and you are virtually here. It's not a body. You don't care so much about bodily being, so hey, you are here and you are with us. I think we will, all of us, through the whole day, and talking particularly about now with you, Ben, we have had so much stimulation, so much to think about, so many different issues to think about. I would like to thank you so much on behalf of everyone who is here and who is here with you, but I would also like to say that we will keep on thinking through these issues all through tomorrow and beyond that. This is a symposium. It is not a dissemination. It is not an end point. It is an ongoing discussion.
Please let's stay in touch. I would very much like that. And as soon as we can, Ruth and I want to come to Poland. There's a spiritual, we're Slavic people, I guess. I'm not. Anyway.
Good, thank you. I have my own alarm clock in the church across the road, which is chiming 5:15. So I think I should finish for today. We are all on back tomorrow at 9 o'clock in Polish time, 8 o'clock UK time, and different times across the rest of the world. to have people from 17 countries with us.
My God.
We have plenty of clocks going on that. Thank you so much again, and thank you to all today's presenters and organisers, and have a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, or middle of the night, depending on where you are.
I tend to have a number of beers and think of you guys.
Thank you. Cheers then. Have a good time. And goodbye to everyone else. We will close down now, and we will see you tomorrow. Goodbye.